Humans walk away from peace talks. The Galactic Council immediately regrets. Vid. Part 1. The station was called Conquered Spire, and it floated in the dark between a dozen stars like a giant silver ring. It had been built to impress. Its walls were made of a material that caught light and threw it back in soft colors. Its corridors were wide enough for 6 beings to walk side by side. The gravity inside was kept comfortable for the majority of species that used it, which meant it was slightly too low for humans and slightly too warm. Ambassador Clint Harlow had been uncomfortable since the moment he stepped off the shuttle. He was a big man, wide in the shoulders, with a round face and short gray hair. He came from a small town in Ohio and had spent 30 years moving between government offices and foreign meetings, learning to sit in bad chairs and listen to people say one thing while meaning another. He was good at it. He had built a career on being good at it. His aide, Lieutenant Commander Diane Kessler, walked half a step behind him as they moved through the station's main corridor on the first morning. She was from Georgia, had spent 8 years in the Navy, and had the kind of eyes that noticed everything without appearing to look at anything. She carried a flat data tablet under her arm and had already read every document the council had sent ahead of the talks 3 times. The third member of the human delegation was Colonel Aaron Pruitt. He was lean and quiet, with close-cropped dark hair and the habit of standing with his hands behind his back. He was the military advisor. In 2 full days of talks, he had not said a single word in the chamber. He simply sat and watched and listened and said nothing. The chamber where the talks were held was large and round. 11 delegations sat at a curved table that was shaped like a crescent moon. The humans sat at the far end, which gave Harlow a clear view of everyone else. That at least was useful. The Velfari delegation sat directly across from them. The Velfari were tall, with hard shells, the color of dried mud, and 4 arms that moved in quick, sharp gestures when they spoke. Their lead representative was called High Arbiter Zeskura. He had a voice that sounded like paper being torn slowly. He spoke often. He smiled very rarely, but when he did, it was not the kind of smile that made anyone feel better. The peace talks had been called because the Velfari had been moving their borders. They had been doing it for 40 years. Slowly, carefully, always with a long explanation ready about why the new line made more sense than the old one. None of the other species liked it. None of them had stopped it. The idea of the talks, as Harlow understood it, was to bring everyone together, calm the Velfari down, and agree on a set of rules that would keep the peace. That was a reasonable idea. The problem was what was hidden inside the rules. On the first day, the council presented the framework document. It was long and written in the formal language that diplomatic bodies use to make simple things sound complicated. Harlow read it once in the morning and once that night. Diane read it twice and marked 41 sections with small red dots on her tablet. The core of the document was this: every member species would agree not to take any independent military action without first bringing the matter to the council. The council would then vote. If enough members agreed, a response could be authorized. The voting process, under the terms of the framework, would take a minimum of 40 days. Harlow had not said anything about this on the first day. He had not said anything about it on the second day either. He had sat in his chair, which was slightly too small for him, and he had listened to the other delegations speak warmly about cooperation, shared futures, and the importance of peace. He had drunk the coffee the station synthesized, which tasted like coffee, only in the way that a photograph of a fire tastes like warmth. He had nodded at the right moments. He had asked polite questions. Diane had watched him do all of this and had said nothing herself because she knew what he was doing. He was waiting to be sure. He was making absolutely certain that what he was reading in the document was what the council actually intended. By the end of the second day, he was sure. That night in the small room assigned to the human delegation, the three of them sat together. Harlow had the document open on the table. He pointed to the clause about the 40-day authorization window. He pointed to the clause that required all military movements within human space to be reported to the council. Advance. He pointed to the clause that gave the council the right to request a freeze on any human military operation while a vote was pending. Aaron Prout read each clause in silence. Then he sat back and looked at the ceiling. Diane said, "They've written it so it sounds like everyone is equal in this. But the Velfari already have their expansion done. The lock only works on whoever hasn't moved yet." Harlow said, "That's right." Prout said nothing, but he stopped, looking at the ceiling. On the morning of the third day, the council presented what they called the final draft. There were small changes from the previous version. The language was softer in a few places. The 40-day window had been reduced to 35. None of the three core clauses had been changed. Harlow read it. He took his time. The chamber was quiet while he read, which was unusual because the chamber was almost never quiet. 11 delegations tended to fill room. He finished reading. He set the document down on the table. He picked up his pen, which was a plain metal pen he had carried for 15 years, and he put the cap back on it. He straightened his jacket. He looked over at Diane. She was already looking at him. She gave a very small nod, barely more than a tilt of her head. He looked at Prout. Prout was already standing. Harlow stood up. He buttoned the top button of his jacket. He looked around the chamber at the 11 delegations, at the crystalline walls, at the soft-colored light, at Zeskura, sitting across from him with that rare and unhelpful smile. He spoke in a calm and level voice. He thanked the council for their hospitality. He said that the station was impressive, and that the effort everyone had put into the talks was obvious, and he respected it. He said that humanity had thought hard about the framework and understood what it was trying to do. Then he said that humanity had survived 2 world wars. It had survived a century of burning its own sky. It had survived 3 separate moments where the wrong decision by a small number of people could have ended everything, and those decisions had not been wrong, partly because the people making them had not needed to wait 35 days for a committee to vote. He said that humanity was not willing to put the safety of its people behind a permission process run by a body that had never once in its entire history moved quickly. Then he said the words, "We're going home." He picked up his pen and his copy of the framework document, and he walked toward the door. Diane was already gathering her tablet. Prout was already 3 steps ahead of both of them. The chamber did not erupt. It did not fill with noise or argument or protest. It went completely, absolutely silent. Not the silence of people waiting for someone to speak, but the silence of people who had just watched something happen that they had not believed was possible and were still deciding whether it was real. Harlow did not look back. The door to the chamber opened, and the 3 of them walked out into the corridor, and the door slid shut behind them, and the silence on the other side of it continued for a very long time. Humans walk away from peace talks. The Galactic Council immediately regrets it. Part 2. The silence in the chamber lasted for almost a full minute. That was a long time for a room full of 11 species who were rarely quiet about anything. Then High Arbiter Zeskora stood up, and the room stopped being silent. He was loud. His voice, which already sounded like tearing paper, went up several levels and took on a sharp, grinding quality that the chamber's translation system struggled to keep up with. He said that the humans had shown bad faith. He said they had wasted everyone's time. He said that walking out of a council session was an insult to every species in the room, and that the human delegation should be recalled, formally reprimanded, and barred from returning until they were prepared to behave like civilized members of the galactic community. Several other delegations agreed with him. Not all of them agreed loudly, but they agreed. Heads nodded, fins moved in the gesture that the Orbit High used for assent, and 2 of the smaller delegations added their own complaints to the pile. Councillor Farron, the council's secretary general, called for order. He was a Salathi, which meant he had 4 arms, pale green skin, and the natural manner of someone who had spent decades managing disagreements between beings who could not agree on which direction the sun rose. He was good at his job. He got the room quiet again within a few minutes. Then he said that the council needed to decide how to respond. The first hour of that discussion was mostly noise. Delegations repeated what Zeskora had said in different words. The word insult came up many times. The word unacceptable came up more. Everyone agreed that something needed to be done. Nobody agreed on what. What nobody said out loud in that first hour was the thing that was sitting at the back of every mind in the room. What were the humans going to do now? The Orbit High delegation asked for a recess. This was not unusual. The Orbit High asked for recesses often. They moved slowly, thought slowly, and did almost everything slowly, but the quality of what they produced at the end of a long, slow process was generally very good. The other delegations agreed to a 2-hour break without much argument. The Orvitae senior diplomat was a being called Speaker Uyuval. She was small, even for an Orvitae, with a pale blue shell that she pulled partway closed when she was concentrating. She moved to her delegation's private quarters at the pace she always moved, which was not fast, and she sat down at a low table and opened her personal data slate. She had been thinking about something since the moment the human ambassador had stood up and buttoned his jacket. She pulled up humanity's historical file, not the diplomatic summary. Every delegation had that, but the full record, the one that went back thousands of years. She began to read. She read about wars. Not just a few wars. Hundreds of them. Wars between humans and other humans. That went on for years, decades. Sometimes longer. Wars that ended and then started again. She read about a period called the Second World War and had to stop and reread the numbers attached to it, because she had initially assumed the translation was wrong. The numbers were not wrong. She read about something called a siege. She had a general sense of what a siege was, but reading the details made her understand it differently. A siege was when one group of humans decided that the correct way to defeat another group of humans was to simply surround them and wait, sometimes for years, until the people inside ran out of food or water or both. It required enormous patience. It required the willingness to commit to an outcome without knowing exactly when that outcome would arrive. She read about a concept called mutually assured destruction. She read it twice, then a third time. The idea was that two groups of humans had built enough weapons to destroy each other completely, and the reason neither group had used those weapons was that both of them knew that using the weapons would result in their own destruction as well. This had worked. It had kept two enormous, hostile, heavily armed human governments from destroying each other for decades. Not because of trust and not because of kindness, but because both sides understood that starting the destruction guaranteed their own destruction as well. She pulled her shell slightly more closed and sat very still. Across the station, in a sealed section assigned to the Dren Collective, something different was happening. The Dren did not think the way other species thought. They shared one electromagnetic field between all members present, which meant that when any one of them thought something, all of them thought it at more or less the same time. They did not have individual conversations. They had a continuous, overlapping exchange that most other species found impossible to follow. What the Dren Collective was doing during the recess was running a simulation. They were modeling human behavior. They had been gathering data for this for some time, not because they were suspicious of the humans specifically, but because they modeled everyone as a matter of habit. Modeling was how the Dren made sense of a universe full of beings that didn't share their field. The simulation used publicly available data, human industrial output, known fleet positions, historical response times, the average duration between a human diplomatic breakdown and a human military action based on their own recorded history. The model was not complicated. The inputs were all observable. The output appeared on their shared field within a few minutes. No member of the Dren Collective spoke. The output aloud or wrote it down. They simply held it in their shared field and looked at it together, the way a group of people might stand around a table and look at something that had been placed on it without anyone choosing to touch it. Then the recess ended and they went back into the chamber and said nothing about any of it. When the full council reconvened, Council Farron had drafted a short, formal message to the human diplomatic headquarters on Earth. It was politely worded. It expressed the Council's hope that the human delegation might reconsider its position. It noted that the framework was not yet finalized and that the Council remained open to further discussion of its terms. It did not apologize, but it was softer than anything the council had officially sent the humans. Before, Farron sent it and informed the chamber that he had done so. Zesk-Oroth objected that the message was too soft and represented a concession the council had not voted to make. Farron said that asking someone to come back to a meeting was not a concession. They went back and forth on this for a while. In the end, the message had already been sent, so the argument resolved itself. 6 hours later, the response came back from Earth. It was 3 sentences. Farron read it aloud. The first sentence said that the delegation's position had not changed. The second said that humanity reserved the right to defend its people and its territory without prior authorization from any external body. The third said that humanity wished the council well. Farron read all 3 sentences twice. Then he set the message down. Zesk-Oroth said that the response was rude. Several delegations agreed with him. The Dren Collective said nothing. Speaker Uyuval, who had returned from her quarters looking like someone who had spent 2 hours reading things she wished she could unread, also said nothing. She sat with her shell partly closed and her data slate face down on the table. The session ended without any agreement on next steps. Most delegations returned to their quarters. Farron stayed in his office for a long time with the 3-sentence message on his desk. In a small side corridor of the Concord Spire, a junior attaché from the Velthari delegation was standing in front of a wall-mounted star map. He had pulled up a display of known human-controlled space. He was looking at the fleet markers on it. He had been looking at them for almost 20 minutes. Most of the markers were positioned at human border systems, which was not unusual. But there were a lot of them, more than he had remembered. And the spacing between them was not the spacing of a fleet waiting to be given orders. It was the spacing of a fleet that already knew exactly what it was doing. He went to find High Arbiter Zesk-Oroth. He knocked on the Arbiter's door, waited, and when the door opened, he stood very still for a moment, trying to find the right words. Then he simply pointed at the data slate he was carrying, which had the star map open on it, and said nothing. Zesk-Oroth looked at the map for a long time. Then he closed the door, and the attaché stood alone in the corridor, and the station hummed quietly around him, and somewhere in the dark between the stars, the human delegation ship was still moving, steady and unhurried in the direction of home. Humans walk away from peace talks. The Galactic Council immediately regrets it. Part 3. The INS Coldwater was not a large ship. It was built for moving people quickly between places, not for fighting anything, and its interior reflected that. Narrow corridors, small rooms, functional lighting, and a constant low hum from the engines that you stopped noticing after the first few hours. There was one decent-sized common room, a galley that made real food rather than synthesized approximations, and a communication bay at the back of the ship behind a door that locked from the inside. 3 hours after leaving Concord Spire, Colonel Aaron Prout walked into the communication bay, locked the door behind him, and sat down in front of the terminal. He placed a call on the other end of the line. After a short delay for encryption and distance was General Louise Farr. She was the commander of the Human Interstellar Defense Command, and she was sitting at her desk at the Defense Command Headquarters outside Colorado Springs at what was for her 4:00 in the morning. She had been awake. She had been expecting the call. Pruitt said, "The talks are done." "We walked." Farr said, "How did they take it?" Pruitt said, "The way you'd expect." Loud for a while. Then quiet. Farr asked a few short questions. She asked whether the council had been surprised. Pruitt said yes. She asked whether the Velthari had pushed back. Pruitt said Zesk Oroth had been the loudest voice in the room after the walkout based on what the monitoring equipment in their delegation quarters had picked up through the walls. Farr did not ask how he knew that. She had read his service record. She knew how he knew things. She asked whether the human delegation's exit had been covered by the council station feeds. Pruitt said, "Every angle." Farr said, "Good." Then she said, "Understood," and ended the call. Pruitt sat for a moment in the communication bay, listening to the hum of the engines, then unlocked the door and went to find something to eat. What happened next was not loud, and it was not dramatic, and no single person made a single large decision. It was a series of small things done by ordinary people in ordinary places that added up to something the Galactic Council would not fully understand until later. On Able Gate, a frontier station positioned at the outer edge of the human border, a crew of civilian dock workers finished the last hour of their overnight shift. They came up from the lower deck, smelling of grease and recycled air, and went to the canteen for coffee. Behind them, moving through the same corridors in the opposite direction, came a military maintenance team. 14 people in gray coveralls, carrying diagnostic kits and fuel manifold tools. They moved to the warship bays without hurrying, split into pairs, and began their checks. Nobody told the dock workers anything. Nobody needed to. The dock workers drank their coffee and went home. On the colony world of New Meridian, a garrison of 300 soldiers received a short message from their commanding officer telling them that the rotation schedule was postponed until further notice. There was no explanation given. There rarely was with postponements. The soldiers updated their calendars and kept doing what they had been doing. In the shipyards above the planet Carver's Rock, a vessel called the INS Hartwell had been 2 weeks from completion. It was a mid-range patrol craft designed for border monitoring, not a warship exactly, but built along the same lines. It had been moving through its final inspection phase at the standard pace, with one crew shift working each day. After Farr's call ended, a message went out to the Carver's Rock Yard management. It did not say much. It said that the Hartwell's completion schedule had been updated and that all available shifts should be assigned immediately. By that evening, 3 full shifts were working on the Hartwell around the clock. None of these things, taken alone, meant very much. A maintenance check on a warship at a border station was routine. A garrison rotation being pushed back happened all the time. A shipyard working extra shifts to finish a vessel ahead of schedule was not unusual. But if someone had been watching all of these things at the same time across the width of human space, they would have noticed something. Everything was moving in the same direction. Everything was tightening quietly, like a hand closing slowly into a fist, so slowly that each individual finger Looked like it was just resting. Back on the Coldwater, Ambassador Harlow was having dinner. The galley on the Coldwater was small, but the cook, a young man from Louisiana, named Pete, whose last name Harlow could never quite remember, was genuinely good. He had brought real provisions from Earth, proper bread, real vegetables, tin of coffee that smelled the way coffee was supposed to smell. He made a meal that had no approximations in it, and Harlow ate it with the quiet pleasure of a man who had spent 3 days eating things that were almost food and had finally reached the real thing. Diane Kessler sat across from him. She had her tablet flat on the table and had not looked at it in 20 minutes, which was unusual for her. She asked, "Do you think they'll reach out again?" Harlow said yes. She asked how soon. He thought about it while he chewed. He thought about Farr, who was smart and had been reading the room better than the rest of them. He thought about the Orvieto delegate, who had asked for that recess and come back looking like she had been unsettled by something she found in her own files. He said soon. Diane looked at her coffee cup. She said, "And when they do?" Harlow said, "That depends on whether they figured out what they were actually asking us to agree to." She said, "You think they didn't know?" He said, "Some of them didn't. The Velfari knew. Farr probably knew. The smaller delegations were just glad someone was finally putting a structure around things. They didn't look at whose structure it was." Diane was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The Orvieto delegate looked different when she came back from that recess." Harlow said, "I noticed." They sat in a comfortable quiet for a while. The Coldwater hummed around them. The stars outside the small porthole, the galley wall, were moving slowly, the way stars always looked when you were going fast enough that their positions shifted against the dark. Prout came into the galley, poured himself a cup of coffee, and leaned against the counter. He did not sit down. He never sat down in informal settings, if he could help it. Standing was a habit he had never broken. He said, "Farr says hello." Harlow said, "Tell her I owe her a dinner." Prout said, "I'll pass it on." He drank his coffee and looked at the porthole and said nothing more. In his office on Concord Spire, Consul, Farr had received the tactical briefing that the Dren Collective had been quietly holding since the afternoon. They had finally decided to share it, which told Farr something about how seriously they were taking the situation, because the Dren did not share things unless they had decided the alternative was worse. The briefing was 11 pages. It had no dramatic language in it. It did not use words like threat or danger or alarming. It was written the way the Dren wrote. Everything in plain statements of observable fact, one after another, without commentary. It listed human fleet positions. It listed human industrial output over the last decade. It listed the known number of active military personnel, the known number of reserve personnel, and a note explaining that these numbers were likely conservative because human record keeping of reserve forces was done in a way that made accurate external counting difficult. It listed 3 historical examples of human military mobilization speeds with timelines. It listed the average gap between a human diplomatic breakdown and the first movement of human military assets. That last number was the one Farr read twice. Then he sat in his chair and looked at the wall for a while. Then he opened a new message window and began to type. He did not write to the human delegation. This time, he wrote directly to the human government's foreign office on Earth. He wrote it himself without asking his assistants to draft it. He wrote carefully. He chose every word the way a person chooses their footing when walking on ice, slowly with full attention, testing each step before putting weight on it. When he finished, he read it over once, made 2 small changes and sent it. Then he leaned back in his chair and waited, because waiting was all he could do, and he had gotten very good at it over a long career, but he had never found it easy. Humans walk away from peace talks. The Galactic Council immediately regrets it. Part 4. 3 weeks after the human delegation left Conquered Spire, the Velfari hegemony made its move. They had been planning it for months. The peace talks had never been the reason for the plan, and the breakdown of the talks was not what started it. The plan had always been there, sitting in a drawer waiting for the right moment. The Velfari were patient in this way. They made decisions slowly and then carried them out quickly, and by the time anyone else noticed, the thing was already done. The system they were targeting was called the Keller Drift on human star charts. It was not inside officially claimed human territory. It was in the gray zone, the wide belt of unclaimed space between the edge of human expansion and the nearest edge of Velfari expansion. It was uninhabited. It had no stations, no colonies, no permanent population. What it had was an outer asteroid field, full of a particular mineral compound that was useful in construction and worth a significant amount to whoever held the rights to it. For 10 years, human prospecting vessels had been working the outer fields of the Keller Drift under a provisional extraction agreement. The agreement was registered with the Galactic Council and had been renewed 3 times. It was not a claim of full territory. It was simply a working arrangement. The humans would extract what they needed, pay a small fee to the Council's resource registry, and the space would remain open. The Velfari hegemony's position was that this agreement was no longer valid, because the hegemony was now formally declaring the entire Keller Drift system as Velfari territory. This declaration had been filed with the Council that morning. Fleet Voice Dureth led the border fleet into the system at mid-cycle. He was a senior commander with a long record of exactly this kind of operation. He had done it 4 times before in other systems. The process was always the same: arrive with enough ships to make the point clearly, issue the formal notice to any non-Velfari vessels present, give them a reasonable window to leave, and then begin establishing positional beacons and marking the system as hegemony space. There were 2 human vessels in the system when Dureth arrived. They were civilian haulers. The first was a ship called the Carla, a wide, flat-bodied thing with external cargo cradles that were about half full of processed ore. The second was called the Broken Promise, which Dureth found an interesting name for a human ship, though he did not spend much time thinking about it. They were both positioned in the asteroid field, which was where the mineral deposits were, and they were both running their extraction equipment. When his fleet came out of transit, Dureth hailed them through standard channels. He informed them that the Keller Drift was now officially Velfari territory under a formal annexation declaration filed with the Galactic Council. He informed them that their extraction permits were no longer valid. He gave them one standard cycle, about 14 hours, to complete any active extraction cycle they were in the middle of, pack their equipment and leave the system. He expected acknowledgement and a quiet departure. That was what happened every other time. What happened instead was this: the Carla Me acknowledged the message. The broken promise acknowledged the message. Both ships stopped their extraction equipment, which was the expected part. But then neither of them moved. Instead, they sent a reply. The reply said that they were acknowledging receipt of the notification and were formally requesting clarification of the legal basis for the annexation declaration, specifically whether the Council had confirmed the validity of the filing, given the existing extraction agreement. The reply also said that both vessels were opening a direct communication channel to the Human Interstellar Defense Command to report the situation. Durith read the reply twice. He was irritated. The request for legal clarification was a delay tactic, and they both knew it. But it was a legitimate delay tactic, and firing on civilian haulers that had not done anything aggressive was not something he was going to do. He extended the window to 2 standard cycles and went about the business of establishing the hegemony's positional beacons. 12 hours later, 2 human warships dropped out of faster-than-light transit at the edge of the Keller Drift. They were not a battle fleet. They were listed in human naval records as a patrol response group, which was essentially what the name said, a unit designed to move quickly to a location and assess a situation. But Durith was a fleet commander, and he understood ships, and he understood what he was looking at. The 2 vessels were not large by battle fleet standards, but they were well armed, well built, and their electronic profile was clean and organized in a way that told him their crews knew exactly what they were doing. They did not come in fast. They came in at a measured, deliberate speed, the way someone walks into a room when they want everyone to know they are not rushing because they do not need to rush. They took up a position at the outer edge of the asteroid field and held it. Then they opened a channel. The voice on the channel belonged to Captain Nora Fleming. She identified herself calmly, gave her vessel and unit designation, and said that she was responding to a reported situation involving 2 civilian vessels operating under a valid provisional extraction agreement. She said that the Carla May and the Broken Promise would be departing the system at the end of their operational cycle, as was their right under the terms of the agreement, and that she was on station to ensure their safe departure. She did not say anything threatening. She used no aggressive language. Her voice had the steady, unremarkable quality of someone who was doing a thing they had done before and expected to be able to do without interruption. Durith told her that the provisional agreement had been made invalid by the formal annexation declaration. Fleming said that the declaration had not yet been reviewed or confirmed by the Council and therefore could not be considered binding. Durith said the hegemony did not require Council confirmation to establish territorial claims. Fleming said she understood his position and would note it in her report. Then she stopped responding. Her 2 ships simply stayed where they were. Durith was not used to this. He was used to people leaving when it became clear that a Valtharian fleet was present and serious. He requested a reinforcement contingent from the nearest hegemony stronghold. The request went through the hegemony's command chain. Confirmation came back within a few hours. Reinforcements were on the way. The word that reinforcements had been requested also reached the Galactic Council within hours. The Valthari had not tried to hide the request because they had no reason to think hiding it was necessary. Council Farron called an emergency session. The chamber filled. Zescorth attended, looking the way he always looked, composed, certain, and faintly amused at the inconvenience of having to be present. The council had been aware of the annexation filing and had not yet issued a response to it, which was normal. The council rarely moved quickly on anything. Farron did not spend much time on formalities. He had received a message from the Human Interstellar Defense Command 40 minutes earlier, and he read it aloud to the chamber in full. The message said three things. It said that humanity considered the Valthari annexation declaration to be unilateral and invalid. It said that any act of aggression against human civilian vessels or human military personnel in the Keller Drift would be considered an act of war against humanity itself. And it said that no council authorization would be sought or required for any response humanity chose to make. The chamber was quiet when he finished reading. Then a member of the Dren Collective made a sound that the translation system identified after a short delay as approximately equivalent to a wince. It was a very small sound, but in that quiet room everyone heard it. Zescorth began to speak. He said that the human statement was aggressive and inflammatory. He said that the annexation was a legal Valthari action. He said that the council should formally reprimand the human government for the tone of the message. Nobody disagreed with him out loud, but nobody agreed with him out loud either. Speaker Uyuval sat with her shell closed most of the way. She had not said a word since sitting down. She was looking at the table. Something about the way she was sitting, very still, very careful, made several of the delegates near her uncomfortable, without knowing exactly why. Outside the chamber, in the dark between the stars, the Valthari reinforcement fleet was moving toward the Keller Drift, and Captain Nora Fleming's patrol group was still exactly where it had been, not moving, not threatening, simply present. And somewhere else in that same dark, in positions that the Valthari fleet tracking network had not yet registered. Other things were also moving. Humans walk away from peace talks. The Galactic Council immediately regrets it. Part 5. The Valthari reinforcement fleet arrived at the Keller Drift 9 hours after leaving its staging point. It was a significant force, 23 ships, including 4 heavy cruisers and a command vessel that fleet voice Durith transferred to immediately upon its arrival. He now had the kind of presence that had resolved every previous operation without a single shot being fired. Numbers had always been enough before. When the fleet completed its transit into the system, Durith ordered a full sensor sweep. The results came back and he read them twice. Captain Fleming's 2 patrol ships were still there, but they were no longer the only human vessels in the system. In the time it had taken the Valthari reinforcements to travel to the Keller Drift, 12 human warships had arrived. They were positioned at 3 separate points in the asteroid field, arranged in a pattern that covered every obvious approach to the civilian haulers at its center. There was also a large vessel positioned at the far edge of the system that Durith's sensor teams could not get a clear reading on. They could see it was there. They could not tell much more than that. Every time they pointed their sensors at it, the readings came back muddled and inconsistent, like trying to look at something through moving water. He had never encountered a ship that did that to sensors before. Durith had 23 ships. The humans had 12 plus the unreadable one. On a pure numbers basis, he still had the advantage. But the 12 human ships were arranged in a way that would cost him something to move through. And the ship he could not read was sitting at a position that covered his fleet's most natural exit route. He held his position. The humans held theirs. The Carla May and the Broken Promise stayed where they were, their extraction equipment still powered down, waiting. Nobody fired. Nobody moved. The 2 fleets sat in the system for 9 full days and did exactly nothing. At each other. On the 3rd day of the standoff, Council Farron had a private meeting with Speaker Uyuval and 2 other council representatives in a small room off the main corridor of Concord Spire. The meeting had no official designation. It was not on the council's schedule. Farron had arranged it quietly, which was something he did when he had a thought he was not yet ready to present to the full chamber. He said, "We need to go to Earth." Speaker Uyuval said, "All of us." He said, "Enough of us to show that we mean it." The other 2 representatives asked questions. Farron answered them. Not every answer was one they liked, but they were honest answers, and by the end of the conversation, both of the other representatives had agreed that Farron was right, even if none of them were looking forward to what it meant. 5 days later, Farron, Uyuval, and 3 other council delegates boarded a transport and traveled to Earth. Not to a human space station. Not to a neutral location. To Earth itself, which none of the 5 of them had ever visited and which all of them had thought of, until recently, as a distant and somewhat unpredictable place. They landed in Washington. It was spring and the air was wet and cool and smelled like cut grass and distant rain, which none of them had frameworks for. The orbit high biologically registered the complex chemical mixture and filed it under ambient atmospheric particulate. Non-threatening. Speaker Uyuval found it pleasant, though she could not have explained why. Ambassador Clint Harlow met them at the building's entrance. He had not dressed formally. He was wearing a plain suit, a dark tie, and the same metal pen in his breast pocket. He shook each delegate's hand, or whatever approximation of a handshake their biology permitted, and led them inside. The conference room was large and quiet. The table was real wood, which surprised several of the delegates. Humans built things out of material pulled from their own world, sometimes simply because they liked the way it looked. Farron ran one hand across the grain of the table as he sat down, and Harlow noticed and did not say anything about it. There was coffee and water on the table. Diane Kessler was already seated, her tablet in front of her. Colonel Prout stood near the window, looking outside at a river that moved slowly between old stone buildings and new glass ones. Farron said, "We would like to speak. Plainly, if that is acceptable." Harlow said, "That would be my preference." What followed was the most honest conversation that had happened between the council and the human representative since humanity had first made contact with the galactic community. Farron spoke first, and he did not use the formal language of diplomacy. He spoke the way a person speaks when they are tired of pretending that the formal language is saying what they mean. He said that the framework had been a mistake, not in its intention but in its design. He said that the council was afraid. He said that they had been afraid of the Valthari for 40 years and had done nothing about it because none of them alone were willing to be the one who acted first. He said that the framework had been written with humanity in mind, not as a problem to be contained, but as a solution to be attached to, and the mistake they had made was writing it in a way that looked like a cage. He said, "We needed to ask for your help. We wrote a document instead." Harlow looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Then why didn't you just ask?" The room was quiet. Yovel said very carefully, "We were not certain you would say yes." Harlow said, "You were not certain, so you built a structure that didn't give us the choice." She said, "Yes." He sat with that for a moment. Then he looked at Diane. She gave him the small nod he was waiting for. He said, "All right. Let's talk about what a real agreement looks like." Diane Kessler worked through that night. She had a pot of real coffee and a blank document and the full text of the original framework, which she was not going to use but wanted visible as a reminder of what not to do. She wrote in plain language, short sentences, clear terms. The new agreement did not ask humanity to seek authorization before defending itself. It did not create a council permission window. It did not require advance notice of military movements. What it did was this: it established that if a council member was threatened by an external aggressor, they could formally request human assistance. Humanity would then decide at its own discretion whether and how to respond. There was no obligation to respond. There was no committee. There was no vote. It was simply a door that the council could knock on, and whether the door opened was humanity's choice. The enforcement clause was the part that took the most time. Diane rewrote it 4 times before she was satisfied. It established that any aggressor, confirmed by at least 7 council members to have committed a hostile act against a signatory, would face a joint response coordinated by a small committee, but the committee's function was logistical, not approval-based. The decision to act had already been made by the fact that 7 members confirmed the aggression. The committee just decided how. The agreement was 11 pages. The original framework had been 63. All 5 council delegates signed it. Farron signed his name slowly and then held the pen for a moment before setting it down, the way people hold things they are about to let go of. Harlow signed last. He used his metal pen. The Velfari hegemony did not sign. They sent a formal diplomatic objection through the council's registry, which Farron acknowledged and filed. 2 weeks after the signing, Nora Fleming's fleet was still in the Keller Drift. The Velfari reinforcement fleet, without announcement and without any statement from the hegemony, had quietly begun moving back toward its staging point. 1 ship first, then 2, then the rest. Durith's command vessel was the last to go. It did not move in a hurry, but it moved. No announcement was made by anyone. The Carleme and the Broken Promise completed their extraction cycle, loaded their cargo cradles, and went home. The day after the signing ceremony, Colonel Aaron Prout was seen sitting outside on a low bench near the building's side entrance, eating a sandwich. The afternoon light was coming through the trees at a low angle, and the river was visible between the branches. A junior aide from the diplomatic staff was passing through and slowed down when she saw him. She asked, "Sir, do you think this worked out the way it was supposed to?" Prout took a bite of his sandwich. He looked at the river. He said the council thought walking away was a bluff. She asked, "Was it?" He finished the last of his sandwich and stood up. He brushed a crumb from his jacket. He said, "Patience." Then he went inside, and the river kept moving, and the trees moved in the wind. And overhead, in the dark that the afternoon sky was hiding, human ships held their positions and waited for whatever came next, because waiting was something humanity had always known how to do.